We have an Arctic blast on the way coming for that second week of January that will initially set up cross-polar flow and bring back some heavier snows back in the picture, as well as we watching the polar jet start to possibly interact with the subtropical jet. That's typically a favorable pattern if you'd like to see any type of wintry precipitation for those areas that live deeper into the south. So things get pretty interesting as we head into that second week of January. So if you are new to the channel and like detailed weather breakdowns, hit the subscribe button and you're in. You get all my daily content on this channel, and I would love to reach 250,000 subscribers by the end of the month. You can see I'm only 600 away, guys. You can help me get there by subscribing to the channel and following all my daily content. So for right now, we're still plenty warm across the lower 48 today, and even tomorrow we're going to be seeing well above average temperatures for the last couple of days of December. But things do change as we head into that first week of January. So we'll start to see initial colder, if not Arctic air, really start to build across the Yukon territory. That will set up cross-polar flow again and bringing back some colder temperatures back in the picture. Now, this is likely not Arctic air, at least for the first week of January, but that will bring some cross-polar flow back in the picture and allow some heavier snows to move back in. So the favorable areas to see some heavy snow, at least in that first week of January, would likely be into Montana, through areas of Wyoming, back into the Rockies, further south into Kansas, swinging across into Missouri, as well as into Kentucky and up into the Ohio Valley, and those that live into the north central U.S. and along the Great Lakes, as well as into New England, with some heavier snow probabilities once we get into that, say, that fourth time frame, fifth and sixth, when we start to see that initial plunge of some of that Arctic air entering back in the picture for those areas that live across Montana. But going into next week, I think the Arctic air mass initially arrives sometime on Sunday. Now, Arctic air is pretty dense. It travels a lot faster, what the models look like. So it actually even could be arriving a little bit sooner than that. But for right now, by the time you wake up on next Monday morning, you were talking January 6th timeframe, it's going to be plenty cold with that Arctic air entering the picture back in the lower 48. We've got negative numbers showing up on the map. We got teens below zero back into Montana, as well as in the Dakotas through Minnesota, swinging as far south as Iowa. Single digits start to creep into Kansas, back into Missouri, as well as into Illinois. We got teens dropping all the way south as far as Oklahoma by then. We got 20s spreading all the way deeper into Texas, as well as into the southeast, with 20s raking up into the Ohio Valley, with that first initial colder Arctic air blast that's coming on the table. And along with it, it will allow the overturning and drop that snow line even a little bit further south. So now we're talking the snow could potentially reach the Texas Panhandle. And for those areas that live into Oklahoma by then, you know, once we get into, say, the sixth time frame with that initial surge of that Arctic air mass coming back in the picture, initially starting that second week of January. But where it gets interesting as we get deeper into that second week of January, say around that eighth time frame, we start to see the jet stream, which is your polar jet, continuing to pump very cold Arctic air, the coldest air mass of the season. And this likely interacts with the subtropical jet at the same time. So you got a southwest flow, and then you got a northerly flow pumping in colder air. And a lot of times that will cause like an overrunning type setup. And that could allow probabilities to enhance winter weather probabilities for those areas across the south. So things that actually get pretty interesting, you know, as we get into that middle part of that second week of January, because we'll see some of that blocking really start to take shape across the board. When you're looking at the northern hemisphere right now, you got the blocking, you know, across Greenland. You got the blocking across Alaska. That's usually a favorable pattern to really lock in the cold underneath. And that's exactly what's going to play out as that Arctic air mass, that's going to be plunging from the Yukon territories and really settling in into the lower 48. And with this setup, should lock in the cold, for an extended period of time, because we've got a pretty dense Arctic air mass. I mean, underneath that, we're talking almost a 1050 Arctic air mass setting up over across Montana, but even for those areas across Kansas into the Central Plains, a 1043. You know that's some Arctic air underneath that, and that's exactly what the temperatures look like too. So we could be seeing that negative numbers dip all the way into Colorado as well as into Kansas, through Nebraska, getting into Iowa, Missouri. These are below zero temperatures going into, say, that January the 8th time frame. We've got 20 below zero up there into Illinois, 16 below into Chicago. So definitely some dense Arctic air, single digits entering the picture into Oklahoma. We've got teens spreading into Texas. So this is going to be some, obviously the coldest air of the so far of the season that's going to be on the way. And it's going to feel like it too. Here's some of your potential feels like temperatures of dropping dangerously cold. We're talking 40 below zero, what it feels like, 37 below zero. So this is definitely true Arctic air that's going to be on the table. Even negative teens, negative wind chills start to enter the picture even into Texas, going into that middle part of that second week of January. Is that continued plunge all the way down into the deep south. Is sure everybody's going to start to feel the effects of that Arctic air by then. But what gets interesting, if that polar jet does start to interact with that more subtropical jet, that could set up a favorable type setup for wintry precipitation for those areas that live across the south, particularly for those areas maybe potentially even into Texas, through Louisiana and back into Arkansas. And this would likely start moving across the southeast, tapping into that subtropical jet, setting up winter weather probabilities, even as far south as the southeast, changing over to maybe an icy mix along the coast into the Carolinas with snow for them. And then that would set up a low pressure center off the eastern seaboard that would really likely to deepen by then and set up a pretty nice nor'easter too. So that's potentially going to be on the table getting deeper into that second week of January, especially if that polar jet really starts to interact with that subtropical jet. So we'll have to watch the timing on this, but it definitely gets cold. And it definitely starts to get pretty interesting as it gets into that second week of January. And that just continues to push deeper into the southeast. So we're talking some pretty frigid temperatures dipping as far south, even into Florida, getting into much of the Carolinas as that Arctic air continues to plunge all the way down into Mexico and then slingshots eastward. So no one really misses out on this. The brunt of it likely stays east of the Continental Divide, but most areas that live east of that corridor is going to be in full effect of that Arctic air mass that will be coming on the table. And if that does come to fruition, even by the 10th time frame, everybody will be locked in. So we're talking widespread teens and 20s as far south as the Central Plains, Southern Plains, and then potentially some below zero temperatures up there in Illinois. And yes, this does factor in a snowpack. So, this would likely factor in about another 10 degrees, even if in fact it does snow. If it doesn't snow in this area, just add about 10 degrees to that, to that temperature. But yeah, that would be teens down there into Florida. So right now the global guidance is spitting out some pretty cold air mass that's going to be on the table for your second week of January. And this is where it gets interesting, because I wanted to show you the ensembles, right? So this is the breakdown. I know that was kind of one run of the European model, this deep out, but even on the ensemble print right now, yes, this is the probability of snow probabilities between now and the next 2 weeks. So a pretty favorable pattern for snow across the northern interior of the U.S., across the north central U.S., across the Ohio Valley, getting into the mid-Atlantic as well as into New England. But even for those areas further south into Oklahoma, you still have 40-50% probability of likely seeing at least some snow. And it's not zero even when you get into Texas. It's not zero when you get to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, back into Georgia, even the Florida Panhandle. It's not zero, guys. I mean, this is actually pretty healthy when you start to see probabilities on an ensemble picture of 40-50% of potentially snow in Alabama, into Georgia, into the Carolinas. So this is definitely kind of a more favorable pattern coming up for that second week of January. If you do, in fact, like wintry weather or precipitation, this could be a favorable pattern. So obviously we'll be fine tuning this, because this is the Canadian kind of looking at the exact same way, right? The still favorable icy, snowy type setup, even for those areas across the deep south. And the GFS ensembles is pretty much implying the same thing. So even at this, long range, we're looking at the global guidances of the Euro, the American model, as well as the Canadian model, all three coming together and saying, hey, this snow line is going to be interacting with that polar jet, as well as the subtropical jet further south, pulling the probabilities of snow probabilities further south as well, and setting up the stage for a pretty snowy setup going into that, not just that first week of January, but definitely into that second week of January. So definitely things get interesting as we flip the calendar into 2025. So guys, I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch me next update. Why I protect you before and after the storm.